So this is lecture 6 in our series in ideology and politics. I'm going to call this Bourgeois ideology, Frankfurt critical theory, and postmodern ideology. Just previous to these lectures, we looked at Smith, Hegel, and Marx in terms of the leftist wing of liberalism. Most people don't think of Karl Marx as the leftist tradition within liberalism, but he is very much stands with that heritage, the notion of liberty and equality, the overthrowing of the entrepreneurial, the bourgeois class, which inhibit equality and liberty, and unlike elements of liberalism, which tends to favor liberty for some, but not as much for others. We think Marx's thinking, to use the notion, it's one for all and all for one. So the liberty of each must be contingent on the liberty of all. And then in Marx's understanding of history, it's very progressive as well. So the dialectic ever forward, the past does not quite have the enlightened economic understanding and social context that Marxism provides. And so the leftist tradition in liberalism offers a perspective in which the whole ethos of Marxist thought moves forward in a dialectical manner to bring about the common good in that sense. And it's a progressive notion of history, but very much drawing from the liberal principles, as I mentioned earlier, of agency, of liberty, equality, of choice, but it's much more communal understanding in which none are free until all are free in that sense. Now, the critique of Marxism and the critique of liberalism, as mentioned in my previous lecture that looked at the opponents of liberalism, Nazism, fascism, and communism, that was throughout, obviously, the 1920s and 30s, finally overcome, overwhelmed, and the bourgeois form of liberalism dominated again. And I want to lightly touch on some of that as I move forward. And this will be, as I mentioned previously, looking at bourgeois ideology, then the Frankfurt School or critical theory, and then certain postmodern ideas we find in Derrida, Foucault, and there's many others who are the leftist sort of read of Nietzsche, and there's obviously right-wing reads of Nietzsche as well. But what is bourgeois ideology, and how is it distinctively and uniquely liberal? Within the bourgeois tradition, there is the notion that, again, to the degree the individual uses their liberty in a responsible way, and in an economic way, they are likely to do well in the world economically when they give themselves in a disciplined way to get their education, to get the learning they ought to. They enter the workplace in a responsible and disciplined manner. They are going to profit. They are going to profit economically, and as a result of that, they will be able to have the affluence, the wealth that they need to do well in life. And this bourgeois notion of a work ethic, what would be called the work ethic, Protestant work ethic, which emerges in the 16th, 17th century, and when secularized, it just becomes the work ethic. And to the degree a person gives themselves to a responsible life, to work, to putting in the time, the energy, they're going to profit from that economically. They will become affluent. And within a bourgeois tradition, going back to Locke, actually earlier than Locke, the idea is that where there is a serious and committed engagement with one's energy, then there's going to be liberty, there's going to be possessions, there's going to be property, and then the more a person is committed to this sort of lifestyle, there's going to be prosperity, there'll be affluence, and then from there, the ideal is, of course, is that marriages will come together, families will prosper, they will do well, and so there's a general feeling that where there is religion, where there is economics, where there is commitment to some sort of a lifestyle in which meritocracy, effort is engaged, there's going to be prosperity, there will be the good, and it's the role of the state in that within that particular framework to facilitate, to protect those who are engaged in the marketplace, to protect property and possessions, and those who work the hardest, who put the effort in, then have the goods as a result of their effort. Now, if you don't do well economically, if there's not prosperity, from within this argument, there's the notion that you probably were not responsible. You were probably lazy, you were probably passive, that in fact you did not exercise your liberty as you could have, hence you're suffering the consequences economically, in terms of possessions and property, in terms of lifestyle, and all the negative things that can come from that. So underneath this bourgeois particular understanding is again the focus on human liberty, agency, choice, effort, work ethic, and as a result it's almost the comedic understanding, not in terms of ha-ha, but where there is this commitment, good will emerge, wealth will emerge, families will be prosperous, cities will be prosperous, schools will be prosperous, so good will emerge, which is a comedic way of understanding. And so this way of thinking emerging really of religion and economics and politics, really with the 16th, 17th century, the overthrow of the aristocracy. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, if a person has not done that well, that probably says a lot about their work ethic, about their commitment, about their level of using their liberty in a meaningful manner to bring about the good for themselves, for their families, for their community, and in a final sense, obviously, for the state and the country they live in. Life in this way is supposed to be moving along predictably, positively. If I could shift, in a sense, the analogy to someone like Lord of the Rings and Tolkien and The Hobbit. Now, Hobbits in the Shire were your classical example of the bourgeois liberal. Life went predictably. It was safe. It was secure. There were no wars. There were no incursions. Of course, there were petty little squabbles within the hobbits themselves, but rather insignificant in terms of the bigger world that was outside the life of the Shire. So the hobbits for Tolkien very, very much embody that bourgeois liberalism of women, men, families working together economically for the good of their communities. The outside world generally is ignored, and the community thrives to the degree people work meaningfully. They have their own little homes. They're clean. They're efficient, and the community in that self is a good. And so bourgeois liberalism, and this was the tension of little Bilbo Baggins, because he was torn between the bourgeois Baggins side of his family, and yet you have Gandalf coming along and say there's the Took side of your family, the world of risk, the world of chance, the world of uncertainty, but entering into the larger issues of the world, in which there is ambiguity, in which there is tragedy, in which there is war, in which there is poverty, in which there is struggles. And so within the bourgeois soul, there is always this tornness, as we find in Bilbo Baggins and then later Frodo and others who go on the adventure in Lord of the Rings, between the bourgeois Baggins side, which wants predictability, security, cleanliness of home, discipline, order, obedience, and things will work out that way. And then the Took, in which there is adventure, there's uncertainty, there's entering into the bigger issues of war and justice, ecological issues, and issues like that. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, at the end of the Cold War, 1989, Francis Fukuyama published a book called The End of History and the Last Man. Now, by that, he didn't mean the end of history in terms of events. He meant that the principles of liberalism, given the end of the Cold War, the failure of communism, that history was over in terms of the principles of liberal had come to win: liberty, equality, choice, conscience, economic prosperity. And in that sense, Fukuyama was defending that bourgeois tradition, which had won in the Cold War and would move us into the future. Now, he ended that book with Friedrich Nietzsche, also, who was one of the great critics of bourgeois liberalism. And Nietzsche had argued, be wary of bourgeois liberalism because it reproduces in many ways what he called the last man or the last person. And all they would really want to do is their security, predictability, their wealth, their affluence, is what Romans called give them bread and circuses. And so it would be a dimming of human aspiration toward greater and more meaningful things. And so Fukuyama's books looks at the one hand the victory of bourgeois liberalism against communism, but also taps into Nietzsche's worry about the bourgeois person who infirms their whole life is dimmed to achieving possessions, property, amusements, what T.S. Eliot calls being distracted by distraction through distractions. And so bourgeois liberalism both has an immense appeal. There's a tornness within those who buy into it, as I mentioned, between the Baggins side and the Tookish, and then the great critique of that coming from the people like Nietzsche, who we'll get into in a few minutes in this particular lecture. So bourgeois liberalism, or bourgeois ideology in that sense, is central to liberalism. It's wary. It tends to be very wary of leftist tendencies and where they leave in repressing liberty, of undermining the family, of negating class distinctions in that sense. And so it emerged again in a fairly dominant way after World War II. Now, the Frankfurt tradition, I would encourage you, if possible, to watch Tom Nicholas on the Google, the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno, and Critical Theory. The whole notion of critical theory emerged amongst key thinkers in the 1920s in Germany, who assumed after World War I, the people coming back from war would very much be attuned to Marxist thought. There was the 1917 revolution, obviously, in Russia, and the Marxist particularly the Frankfurt School, were convinced that capitalism had failed, that a certain form of Marxism would had an important part to play in the future, and so they were critical of capitalism and the bourgeois tradition in that sense. What they came to see very clearly was in the 1920s, in fact, a form of social liberalism had come to dominate, which was opposed to leftist communism. And so their question, they shifted from the economic questions to social cultural questions. How was capitalism as a form of ideology? What was the good in that? But what in fact was the dangers of capitalism? How did it numb people to asking bigger questions? How did it hinder people in terms of muting in many ways the deeper issues of life by giving them possessions and property, and their only goals then were to become to have more and more toys, more expensive vacations, larger places, and the larger ethical, political, spiritual questions were not being asked anymore. So throughout much of the 1930s, the Frankfurt School had to flee Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power because of their leftist leanings, and Nazism is on the right. They came to the United States and played a very significant role, particularly in the counterculture. Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse were very important in looking at how does capitalism become its own repressive tolerance in that sense. And so they very much tapped into the counterculture of the 1960s in terms of American imperialism, its impact on other parts of the world, Vietnam, Latin America, the Middle East. And when students in a sense, protested some of these at universities and elsewhere, the military was brought in, students were killed. And so on the one hand, the language of capitalism, openness, freedom. On the other hand, the state would often be brought in very quickly to oppose dissent. And it was this, on the one hand, seemingly laissez-faire understanding of capitalism, and yet when the power elite was challenged in that sense, the military and the state and multinationals, what Mills calls the power elite, would move in very quickly and repress liberty. And so the Frankfurt School, certainly in the United States, really exposed the weak backside, or the Achilles heel of capitalism, is on the one hand about openness, liberty, and tolerance. On the other hand, you were only free to go so far. There was only so much liberty, and when vested interests the politics and economics and corporations were challenged, and American foreign policy was doubted, look out! Then comes the heavy hand of the state as it works with corporations. And then, of course, education itself for the Frankfurt School was just training people in technique and skills, but not in the humanities, not in ethics, not in responsible citizenship. And so the Frankfurt School was very much about challenging certain understandings of capitalism as embodied in politics, in the state, in the military, in the educational process itself, which trained people really to be little ants in a colony, little bees in the hive in that sense. Out of the Frankfurt School emerged, as the Frankfurt School moved away from the economic questions more into social cultural issues, they began to have an important impact on postmodern liberalism. Postmodern liberalism, again, continues the principle of choice, of liberty, of conscience, of agency, but it argues very, very clearly that using Foucault for an example, is that given our thrownness, we are all shaped by a time, by a perspective, by a way of seeing things. And this is what Foucault calls the episteme, or what in Greek it's, we get our English epistemology from that word. And so for Foucault, all knowledge is shaped by power interests, and he or she who has the power is likely going to define the worldview, the ideology in that sense. And so knowledge is not somehow floating free, detached from power interests. And so the whole history of ideology, well, who had the power in the 16th century? It was the Catholic Church. They shaped the episteme, the worldview. The Protestants challenged that. And out of that comes the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation has a certain episteme within Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Anabaptist tradition, and their worldview challenged one another. Out of this comes science, which challenges a certain worldview of religion. And then how does feminism and how does working class people, how does their understanding of who they are, is that a worldview that is shaped that they must challenge? And so within postmodernism, there's this constant deconstructing of worldviews that prevent people from being free, because liberty is very important in liberalism. Postmodernism is just a continuation of liberalism, in which each era or each period of history is linked with power and knowledge, and how knowledge limits freedom because of powerful worldviews which shape what can be known. So within Foucault's work, for example, how does the prison system work? How does sexuality work? How is marriage defined in a certain way that is constantly being challenged by those who understand identity in different ways? And so the postmodern notion is built again on these Protestant notions of liberty, deconstruction, protesting worldviews or epistemes in which knowledge and power come together. Now, the dilemma of this, of course, if you challenge certain understandings of power, you do it in the name of power itself. And so the question always is with postmodern thinking is we just change one power dynamic for another. So rather than you have the oppressor, the oppressor has the power and defines knowledge. Now the victim has the power, and they then can oppress. They use their knowledge as an episteme to very, very much define a certain read of history, and then how they treat the perceived oppressor. So you're back in this whole way again of a dualistic or Gnostic or Puritan way of thinking, in how life is reduced to power dynamics. But regardless of how history is interpreted, somebody has the power, and they're going to oppose others who they see as having the power. But underneath postmodernism, again, is just an extension of the liberal notions of liberty and choice and equality. And of course, postmoderns will deconstruct bourgeois notions of the family. They'll deconstruct notions of gender, deconstruct notions of identity, all in the name of liberty. So the protesting spirit of the 16th century continues in the deconstructing nature, merely in a secular way, of postmodernism. And so when we look at bourgeois liberalism, often within this tradition, their fear is what emerges from postmodern liberalism, and also on the left, variations of leftist communism, socialism, say within the Canadian context, the New Democratic Party, obviously within the United States, the fear of the Republicans, of the Democrats. And so we have an in-family squabble within liberalism itself. Whose version of liberty, equality, choice, agency, the individual, the community? And obviously, the left is going to go in one direction, following Hegel and Marx. Bourgeois liberalism very much tries to embody a sort of a centrist position. And then the Frankfurt School, morphing into variations of postmodernism, will deconstruct bourgeois liberalism, and then variations of Marxism, which only reduce reality to economics as they perceive it. And postmodernism is very much interested in social, cultural, literary, identity questions, which elements of historic Marxism didn't, but the Frankfurt School brought to the fore and said, if we're going to deal with the dialectic of history, we have to engage these issues also. So this ends, and as I mentioned earlier, if you could watch Tom Nicholas's The Frankfurt School, he will also give you a nice visual overview of this issue.